John, we've got a very special show today. We're joined by Alex and David from UK Column. Gentlemen, thank you so much and welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's been a couple of months and a lot has happened.
Indeed.
Thank you. It's lovely to join you.
And John, how are you feeling today?
I feel great. Thank you. And I'm honored to have you gentlemen here with us. Your work was called to my attention by one of my viewers. And so I was watching some of your work, and then somebody sent me a message and says, hey, Alex just mentioned you on UK.com. I guess it was a couple of weeks ago. And I'm very grateful for that mention, Alex. And I reached out to Alex and said, thanks, and invited Alex and David to come on the show to, compare notes and see what's their experience been like in the UK. And I guess Alex is a little bit outside of the UK at the moment, but what's going on in Europe? And maybe if we compared notes and share with them what we're seeing and they share with us what they're seeing, who knows? We might actually figure something out together. So I figured, let's get together. Let's see what we can figure out. And so incredibly grateful for you guys coming on the show today. Thank you.
Absolutely. And people can go to UK Column on YouTube and see the daily reports, right? You guys are putting out videos every day, as far as I can see.
Not anymore.
The news goes 3 times a week. The news goes Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and then on the days in between, we've got various other things going up. A regular series on European Defence Union and related matters, military, with one of our colleagues, David Ellis. And on the Tuesdays, it's at the moment myself and Mike, who's the editor at the UK Column, discussing economics and the modern monetary theory or magic money tree and all of the issues that spin off from that. So 5 days a week we're producing something, but it's growing all the time.
So essentially we decided to downsize the news. And simply done that, we've gone up from 3/4 of an hour a day to an hour every other day of the working week. And in between, we actually have thinking time, because we do have day jobs as well, but it gives us thinking time to do an increasing amount of podcasting and article writing.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, tell you what, if you guys don't mind, for our audience that's not familiar with your work and your background, right? So Jason's got a lot of people that he works with at Crowdsource the Truth. And each show that Jason does, the audience is a little bit different from the other audiences. There's some overlap, but sometimes there's people that just watch this show and may not have seen you on Crowdsource the Truth before. So if you don't mind, David, if you'll go first, and then Alex, maybe share with the audience a little bit about your background and how you got into investigative journalism and a little bit of that.
Yeah, certainly. My background is very conventional. I'm a chartered structural engineer. And no, I don't buy the official narrative from 9/11. And I was following the work of a man called Robert Greene, who was campaigning against organised child abuse rings in Scotland. And he was highlighting the case of Holly Gregg, a girl in the Aberdeen area, who was gang raped over years by a well-connected paedophile ring, which involved the head of CID of the local police force, a judge, senior people from education, social work, this sort of thing. He pushed to get a new investigation, eventually succeeded. And when that new investigation didn't even involve questioning the suspects, questioning those accused, no one's computer was searched, no one's house was searched, and the police turned around and said, well, there's insufficient credible and admissible evidence, the case is closed. He decided to go public. He named the people, and then he stood for election. And when he stood for election, he was arrested and locked up. And then he was subsequently rearrested and locked up again, this time in remand. And I started to visit him in jail and campaign for his release. And from there, I went to talking about the case on the UK Column, and from there to talking about everything on the UK Column. So, that was my routine.
Mine was a bit different. It certainly is. David is a very fascinating guy, and people should also look for his new YouTube channel, Northern Exposure. There's several of that name, but if you put in Northern Exposure David Scott on YouTube, you'll find it. I was conventional. Well, we're both wearing conventional Scottish check shirts today. No coordination intended there, but conventional in the sense that I was at GCHQ, Britain's sister agency to NSA, as a linguist covering the former Soviet Union. And I emigrated, actually, people can tell from the backdrop behind me, to the Netherlands. That was for marriage. I was getting a bit disillusioned with GCHQ and NSA at the time, but truth be told, it's in the decades since I left Britain and since I left intelligence that I have discovered more about the unsavory underbelly, or I should say top crust, in British intelligence and American intelligence than I did inside, where I had a happy time with very many conscientious and productive people, actually. So like David, and in the same time frame, because there was definitely a worldwide and US and UK specific awakening about child abuse going on in 2013-ish. That's the period when I became an active participant in the movement, and from that time I've been helping first behind the scenes as the European continent correspondent for UK column, and then in front of the camera as well.
Well, certainly the work that you guys are putting out, I mean, it's no nonsense. It's fact-based research, which Jason and I both are drawn to. I mean, that's what we focus on this show, on fact-based research, right? And my background with databases and systems has helped us gain access to some information that has kind of changed the story. And what we wanted to do in this show with you guys is see if we can, crossfoot a little bit, share with you what we're seeing here in our data and see, are you guys seeing the same thing in your data? And I've got some of your data. So I pulled some of your stuff up. And so, Jason, why don't we get to it and let's share with these guys some of the things that we've been seeing and see if we see some of the same patterns in the UK. All right?
Yep. How's your pandemic?
Possibly plural, right? So how many how many pandemics are you guys having that you know of, right? How many pandemics are there in the UK right now?
We've got a pandemic of lies. We've got a pandemic of fear.
Right.
The total, the official figures in Scotland, the number of people who have died of COVID, the population in Scotland is 5.5 million or so.
Right.
Number of people under the age of 45 who have died of COVID alone without comorbidity is 2. And we shut down the economy.
You're singing my song, David. You're singing my song. I mean, we're going to have a hell of a chorus here. This is going to be interesting. I mean, that's exactly the type of data that we've been digging into here. And I think, what I want to do is compare and contrast the type of information that you just shared with the audience that I guarantee you people just heard what you said and are like, what? That can't be true. That can't be true based on what I'm hearing on the news, what I'm reading in my newspapers. How is that even possible? And yet that is consistent with the type of data that Jason and I have been reporting on now for months on this show. And so your ability to dig into the data, the stuff that we've got, again, I think this is going to be fascinating. And why don't we start at the top, Jason? We've got just sort of the big picture numbers, right? What is the big story? What is the global narrative on coronavirus, right? We're approaching 1 million people dead globally, right? So everybody should be sufficiently panicked now, if you weren't already. There's 1 million people dead from coronavirus, right? So that's a major watershed moment that we're going to pass in the next week or 3 or whatever, right? That's going to cross 1 million. And you're going to hear a lot of fanfare about that. So get ready for that. Let's go to the next slide. This is what it looks like. I charted every single day of COVID. These are the daily deaths of coronavirus in the world. This is every country on earth, every day. How many deaths were reported to the World Health Organization? And that's the chart that we're looking at here. Now, what you're seeing is a binodal outbreak. It had an initial hump at the beginning, then we had a valley, and then we see a secondary peak. But that secondary peak should be the final peak. And now we're achieving something called depletion of susceptibles, which means the people who are going to get it have gotten it. yes, more people are going to get it, more people are going to die, but we should not see a third peak, right? Binodal outbreaks are something that we know happen, and trinodal, I don't think there's anything in history that was trinodal.
This was actually a discussion, if I could just briefly say, which we had on the UK Column News just today, and the logged-in viewers, subscribers, were chatting about this live because the health secretary was claiming a certain hump or a certain curve, and people were noticing in the chat that there had been a hump removed from it, as it were. The Bactrian camel had become a dromedary, and some wags were saying, not knowing that you were about to say this, John, where's the third hump coming?
Indeed. And what you're going to see is in certain countries, it's binodal, and in certain countries, it's not. And again, the question that we keep posing is the binodal outbreak a coronavirus? Second node, is it something else that's being misdiagnosed? And if it is, how would you know the difference if the symptoms are almost identical? So that's what we're going to take a closer look at. So the big picture numbers around the world are what we just looked at a moment ago. But let's go to the next page in that deck. So in the UK, so this is the United Kingdom's stats as of most recently. So this is from Worldometer. So you guys are posting about 42,000 people dead at the moment. Okay, so that's according to Worldometers in the UK. Let's go to the next slide, Jason. And then the United States, because we have to do everything bigger and better than everybody else, we're at 200,000 people dead. Nobody's going to have any more dead than we are, damn it. That's how we do it, right? Now, interestingly, China has fewer people dead than Connecticut.
Well, it's also interesting to note, John, that the narrative has turned seemingly overnight to coronavirus is entirely Donald Trump's fault.
Well, sure. I mean, I don't know overnight. I think it's been his fault the entire time. He wasn't taking it seriously enough. And certainly, we hope you guys are taking it seriously. And Alex, please stop smiling. No smiling. We need you to take this seriously. All right. The Guardian is taking it very seriously with this red headline that they're splashing up there. Coronavirus live news. The UK Health Secretary won't rule out a national lockdown. Global cases past 30 million. And one of the things I've been saying to Jason is, I'm not really that interested in case counts. I'm interested in how many people are dying. If everybody in the UK got coronavirus and nobody died,
right,
I could live with that. That would be all right, right? So I'm not that concerned with cases. Cases is a leading indicator potentially of deaths, maybe, but we have to look at cause of deaths. And David was pointing out comorbidities a moment ago. And we're going to talk more about comorbidities because this is a great way to sort of combine and obfuscate data. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But
now all the news,
Roy,
John, has been talking about a coming second outbreak. That's another thing that seems to have popped up virtually out of nowhere. All the indicators that we're seeing is that death numbers are going down. But everywhere I look, they're talking about the United Kingdom threatening a second nationwide lockdown.
Yeah. And here in the Netherlands, there is talk just as we speak, Friday evening local time, the Dutch government is about to announce some measures for at least the western part of the country.
Wow.
Yeah. And so what we want to do, excuse me, or what I want to do is I want to encourage the population. I want to encourage we the people, the ones that the government is for the people, by the people type of thing, that we the people are looking at the data now. And this is flipping the Panopticon around. It's something that Edward Snowden was talking about the other day when he was on Joe Rogan. He did an interview with Joe Rogan a couple of days ago. And he was talking about how, I think Singapore is maybe the best example of the Panopticon, right? Singapore put in place a system with cameras everywhere where wherever you are, you're being surveilled, right? You're being seen. And the concern is if you spit on the street, if you spit out your gum, if you litter, you'll be arrested for it. And that's the Panopticon. And what Edward Snowden talked about conceptually is that we have flipped the script with the iPhones, and now we're recording them. We're recording what they're doing. And now guys like us, the guys who built these systems, are coming back around. The people who worked on the viruses, like Dr. Judy Mikovits, are coming back around and saying, wait a second, I may not be a whistleblower because I don't work there anymore, per se, right? So I'm not a whistleblower at Oracle because I don't work at Oracle any longer. But I'm certainly the guy who helped put the map together. And so my ability to step in and do things like this and interrupt their narrative is flipping the script on the Panopticon. And it was a very interesting observation that Edward Snowden made on Joe Rogan's show earlier this week. And they were not prepared for this. And quite frankly, Jason, I think it goes back to Las Vegas. I think that was the first major event where the Panopticon was reversed. And everybody was filming the event with their cameras. And we ended up with more footage than the police. And we flipped the script on the police and on the FBI in that case. And I think that's why that case was a watershed moment in what Edward Snowden was talking about. And I found that fascinating.
If I could interrupt just briefly, I would say it's been an evolution of flipping this Panopticon. If we believe that Abraham Zapruder was an independent individual, he started that. Then we saw 9/11, there were a smattering of videos. Now we're in an era where if anything happens, George Floyd murder, we've got a 16-year-old on the scene broadcasting to the world. She becomes a BBC correspondent, a CNN correspondent. We're fully in it now.
No doubt.
And it's not just video either. It's information generally. It's fascinating you use the phrase panopticon, because in Scotland we were using this about how our government was observing us, and specifically a scheme called named person, which is a horrible idea to give every child a state-appointed guardian from actually before birth. And this person was going to be some sort of strange third parent and would collate data. And if they had even a gut feeling that something wasn't right with the family, they would intervene. And the idea was they would intervene before there was any harm.
And so, how many risk factors were there, David, on the government's list? Hundreds?
Something like 221 risk factors and several hundred well-being indicators, which you can't define. So the government decided that they would roll this scheme out and they would embed it in professional practice. So all the people who were teachers and social workers who were on salary, they did what they were told. And all of the major charities were co-opted because they're now government funded. So there was a decision made not to tell the people. Now, what then happened was, at some point when they had to go live with this, they had to inform their own people. They had to hand out information to their own people. And the opposition to this scheme got a hold of vast amounts of data, analysed it, and were then asking questions when they knew more about the government scheme than the government minister who was promoting it. And they were losing argument after argument. And then people were coming up with things like secretly recorded audio, where a government official would be briefing an internal team on the data gathering that they were being obligated to do, and we would get it, and we would then make a whole splash with this information. And eventually the whole scheme foundered. It foundered in the law courts, and it foundered hugely in the court of public opinion. And it foundered on the basis that the people opposing it, the ordinary men and women opposing it, were better informed than the government officials, were being educated by the information that the government itself was putting out. I saw a simple example of this was they were trying to sell it to a youth parliament. So all these kids, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, in a kind of pretendy parliament. They called it the youth parliament, and they were explaining to them. And they had to simplify the language so that the children would understand it. And in doing so, they revealed their hand. And what they said was that this person, this named person, if you think about it as a child, you're a delicate flower. And all of the adults in your life, they're all gardeners, and they've all got to tend you and make and nurture you. But the named person, that's the chief gardener. And that defined it. And if we're parents in that defined it so that everybody in the country could understand. It was their own information, their own PR that actually killed their idea.
And the Scottish government minister responsible for some of that, Eileen Campbell, got a nickname that stuck. She became known as Eileen Also Campbell. By the way, she's just resigned from politics like a lot of her party. She's sensing a turning of the tide. She's called Eileen Also Campbell to the named person campaigners because she said in an unguarded moment, of course, parents also have responsibility for their children.
Lovely. How lovely. Well, I think it's an encouraging story, and I think that people need to hear that it can be done, but it's work. It's something that, one of my heroes, Gary Vaynerchuk, says, do the work. It's not just going to happen because you send out a tweet. Tweets aren't work, people. Tweets are not work.
Huawei's taken 13 years, and I was internal at GCHQ 2007. By the way, the same year that was mentioned in Millie Weaver's ShadowNet documentary, her second whistleblower, The Gentleman, says 2007 is when the military, not civilian NSA, but the military, retrospectively legalized interactive information activities, IIA, basically shaping people's opinion. I saw that at my end. But the same thing, another thing that happened in 2007, Huawei became one of the members of the British Telecom-led consortium that provided GCHQ's internal telephony, so the secure phones within that building you're looking at, to speak to ourselves and to the Americans. And at the time, this was discussed in the internal staff news groups, and we were told in no uncertain terms by our own InfoSec arm, which was then called CESG and now has gone to a sexy building in London and has got a much bigger title, the NCSE. We were told, BT has cleared this with the government, stop talking about it. Well, that's one of the things that made me despair quietly. But we get to 2020, and all of a sudden, whether it's fake or real concern, the Johnson government, under quite a lot of US pressure, has said Huawei is not reliable for civilian unclassified telephony. And there's a Panopticon angle to that, of course, as well, because with the current iteration of the technology, anything you can look at, you can suck back to China or Britain or wherever else is the controlling hand. So this again is a teachable moment, as John was saying, to keep collecting the data and not to give up, because it may be 10, 15 years before the tide turns on the issue of concern to you.
Yeah,
wow. Let me just ask you, sorry, John, real quick, Alex, there's been so much talk today, even it's mounting, about Donald Trump's ban on TikTok. And the New York Times put out a video with a litany of, I don't even think they're millennials. Millennials are old at this point. These are like, 19 and 20-year-olds talking
Generation
about
Antifa.
how, sorry, what is it? Generation Antifa. Exactly. But they're talking about how, TikTok is no big deal and Donald Trump banning it. What is going on with TikTok, Alex? It seems like the Chinese are intent on permeating telecommunications, and TikTok perhaps is gathering information or even controlling people's phones without their knowledge.
I would say that is what it looks like, but there's, without getting into too much of a derailment of John's presentation, there's been a long time agenda for certain people pulling the strings in Britain. You could call them the Oxford Group or whatever, certain people high up in MI6 and the government and the hedge funds, to use China as a test bed for a lot of things. And I don't think the Chinese have got the wherewithal or the interest, as much as the British deep state has, to use these videos ultimately to shorten people's attention span and to put in certain narratives. The big player there is the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Read Daniel Estulin's book of that name and read Dr. John Coleman's book, available as a PDF on that. They are the consultancy that use narrativization and miniaturization of video to get memes in the heads of vulnerable teenagers, basically. So I don't think that's ultimately a Chinese agenda, but certainly the clique which is now falling from favour or declining from public view in the British Civil Service under Sir Mark Sedwill, the outgoing, now gone head of the British Civil Service, they were always pushing Huawei and interoperability with the EU and China. The new guys have more of a front of independent Britain, but when you get down to it, the security and defence, although lip service is paid to NATO and the US, it continues to be a Europe-wide defence and security arrangement. So basically, we are promising the Europeans US nuclear technology, nuclear weapon technology is what it comes down to.
Wow. Right out of the Clinton playbook, it sounds.
Oh, yes. And of course, Joel Skousen has pointed out that PDD 60, Presidential Defense Directive 60, classified text, most likely told the sub-commanders to stand down and to allow a first strike, to absorb it. and it also removed the override at sub-commander level, so that everything goes through the Pentagon only. So it's a multifaceted idea, but certainly Clinton is pretty central to it, both the narrative playing with people's heads idea and the global state building.
Well, listen, John, sorry to derail, but yeah, let's get back to the flu and the UK.
Yeah, it makes makes a respiratory infection seem uninteresting, right? Yeah. Oh, you've got a fever? Okay. Well, how many pandemics are there in the UK at the moment, right? So we certainly there's a fair amount of stuff to scare everybody about coronavirus, but is that the only thing killing people in the United Kingdom? And if it wasn't, how would you know about it, right? So what if there was something else that was killing more people than coronavirus in the UK? What about, other afflictions? Are other afflictions still being tracked, right? So what about tuberculosis? We know tuberculosis kills 3,300 people a day, right? Now, did that stop?
How many?
Yeah, 3,300 people a day are dying of tuberculosis. Yeah, 3,300. Mr. Gates, you got that? Bill? Mike, Bloomberg, wake up, Mike. All right, so 3,300 people a day dying from tuberculosis, right? 550 a day dying from norovirus, right? And these things didn't stop when coronavirus showed up, right? That didn't happen, right? But what we're seeing in the press, a lot of stories, a lot of panic in the UK. We're going to lock you back down again, right? So let's go to the next slide, Jason, and let's take a look at what the data is showing us in the UK. Like, what are we actually seeing, right? So the news it's all panic-stricken. And on the charts, it says that the new cases are going up. And I would like to congratulate you guys, because that means you're doing more testing. And that means your testing efficacy is increasing. You're testing more people. And the more people you test, the more cases you're going to find. And what you may find is that a large number of people have contracted coronavirus and are asymptomatic.
Just this week, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson told us that it will become routine to take a pregnancy-like test when going into work or school in the morning and getting your result within a quarter of an hour. This is not the first strange metaphor he's used. Last year, he said that money spent researching how to help the victims of child abuse to come forward, elite child abuse in particular, was money that had been ejaculated up the wall, although he used a boarding school word for ejaculation instead. So he is quite a one for these metaphors.
That's delightful.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah. So what Jason and I have been trying to do is separate the illusion, which is the part of the story that they can tell you where they're using statistics to manipulate your emotions. And this is what you guys were just talking about, right? That this has been weaponized. These mechanisms of triggering emotions, of using anchoring bias, of leveraging these biases, is being weaponized. And it's being weaponized by the military, it's being weaponized by the government, it's being weaponized by the media. And the media increasingly appears to be working hand in hand with the government, for the government, right? And, for years, people have accused the BBC of just being the mouthpiece for whatever, the Crown wants to say. But increasingly, what I'm seeing is that Reuters and the Associated Press and AP International are towing the line with the narratives, right? We've seen them editing footage. We've seen them leading with certain terminology that's not neutral terminology. And coming from Reuters, coming from the Associated Press, we don't expect partisanship in their reporting. I mean, at least I don't expect it. No. I want to just see the data. I just show us, what's happening, and leave your commentary out of it, Reuters and Associated Press. So as we were talking about before, the reason I got involved in this has to do with these maps, the red map of doom, I called it, coming out of Johns Hopkins. I worked on the team. I led the team that architected this system. And when I saw the Johns Hopkins folks were using this to represent what was happening with coronavirus, I couldn't help but pay attention because it was my system. And it took me just a matter of moments to realize something was very, very wrong, and that somebody had used it to deceive the public. And what I mean by that is they were representing countries where no one was dead as being just as bad as anywhere else. And what we were able to see very early on was relatively few people were dead in Shanghai and Beijing, and yet the World Health Organization was declaring coronavirus a global pandemic. And it was very difficult for Jason and I to come to, well, I shouldn't speak for Jay. I think it was difficult for Jason and I to come to terms with, well, wait a second, why are you declaring a global pandemic if there's less than 10 people dead in Shanghai and there's less than 10 dead in Beijing? There's, at the time, less than 10 dead in Hong Kong. It didn't make any sense. What we were seeing in this map.
Going back to the idea of getting in first with the narrative, BBC and Reuters technique for 100 years, of course, as Jason covers with David Hawkins. I remember at the time thinking Dr. Tedros will be declaring a pandemic any day now, because the talking points for the news cycles for about 72 hours before that was, when will the WHO declare a global pandemic?
Indeed.
There's no way out of that news cycle except Dr. Tedros declaring a global pandemic.
Exactly. And this, I mean, this is NLP. This is preparing people for what's about to happen, right? And we see so many examples of this, and they're using it now in a mass media manner, and in a way, it's group hypnosis. I mean, this is mass hypnosis.
We had a little sort of strange manipulation of the data just before the lockdown in the UK. Because we were reporting all of the hysteria and the hype over COVID, and we were comparing it every week to the figures that were coming out of the Office for National Statistics, which showed that the total deaths in the UK were running below the 5-year average. And this went on week after week after week. So that this panic rhetoric was hyping up, and the death rates were doing nothing at all in the UK. And then they changed the way the statistics were gathered to essentially bring forward a whole lot of deaths that would have been counted in the next week. And that made the figures go just above the 5-year average, so that it looked like there was an upward trend. There was then the lockdown decision, and it was after the lockdown decision that the real spike in deaths, and we'll maybe have a chat about why that is, that the real spike in deaths actually kicked off.
And in fact, all 4 of the nations in the UK and the Republic of Ireland outside the UK have all seen that the long-established government central statistics bureaus, it's the Office for National Statistics in the UK and another body in the Republic of Ireland, have been usually keeping accurate tabs on the reporting. But the public health bodies in each of these 5 different jurisdictions for health purposes have been putting out politicized statistics, to the extent that even Britain's Conservative government now has had to say that Public Health England in particular was so politicized that it had failed and would be replaced with, quote, a future-facing organization.
Wow.
Gotta love it. Well, I went to the Office of National Statistics this week, and I got some of your reports, and we're going to take a look at them, and we're going to see what the data shows versus what the media is telling everybody, and see if they're the same or if they're different. So let's see what we've got. In order to give you guys some perspective as to what we're looking for, this is what we found in the United States. So I'm looking for similar patterns. And yes, this is confirmation bias. Yes, it is. I know when I'm using confirmation bias. I know what I'm looking for, right? So I'm looking for something in particular. And if I don't find it, that's okay. We'll move on, right? But I know there's a certain pattern. What we found in the United States is that more people have died of coronavirus and influenza than not. So of all of the reported coronavirus deaths, more than half of them also had influenza. And that's really important because of the symptoms that we've heard described with coronavirus. We've heard symptoms of people not being able to get enough oxygen, and the symptoms look almost like an altitude sickness. And why that's interesting is that was one of the symptoms from H1N1, the Spanish flu, in 1918. They called it the Blue Death because people's lips were turning blue because they couldn't get enough oxygen in their lungs. So the symptoms of the Spanish flu and the symptoms of coronavirus are remarkably similar, and yet from a virus standpoint, they're not even in the same family tree. Influenza and coronaviruses are different branches of the virus world. They're like, one's like a poodle and one's like a bloodhound. I mean, they're completely different. So why would they exhibit these same characteristics? The other thing that Jason and I heard just a week or two ago from Dr. Joel Graf was that in 1918, the Spanish flu exhibited something remarkable that he never even studied in medical school, called the cytokine storm. And now, one of the defining characteristics of coronavirus is the cytokine storm. So the question is, are we seeing an outbreak? Are we seeing the worst outbreak of this H1N1, the Spanish flu virus, since 1918, simultaneously with the coronavirus outbreak? Are we witnessing two pandemics at the same time? And that the H1N1 is really the one that is the most deadly. And that's what we've been trying to figure out, is we're tracking influenza and we're tracking coronavirus. And in the United States, we have more people dead from influenza than from coronavirus. And it's like, whoa, wait a second. I thought there was a global pandemic of coronavirus. How would we have more people dead from influenza? And that's what has happened already. So this is the big break that we had, was that there's more people dead in the United States from influenza than from coronavirus, according to the CDC's data. And we're going to their system to get their data, and we're charting it. So Jason, let's take a look at that next chart that I had pulled up, if you can. All right, so this is the data and where we get it at our, government CDC thing, which is like, where you guys go, the same sort of site. I get the data, I download it, and then I chart it, and that's it. And these are their numbers updated, within the last 24 or 48 hours that I'm using in these charts here. So let's go to the next page, Jason. Let me show these guys kind of what this looks like. So one of the things that we found in the United States is that categorically, if we look at, can you zoom into the legend there, Jason, up by that blue part of there we go. So people who have died of coronavirus in the United States, 0 to 64 and 65 and older, that's the distribution. So people who are younger than 64 or younger represent about 38,000 of the deaths in the United States. And then people who are 65 and older are about 144,000 of the deaths right now. So this is as of 24 hours ago, right? So as far as the distribution by age, that's pretty interesting. Let's go to the next slide, Jason. We're going to divide this down a little further. In England, I've been looking at the biggest killers, and quite frankly, the reporting coming out of The Sun, UK, has been on the money. They are looking at the data, and I think that's considered like that's like the National Enquirer or something. It's not
it's
really
Rupert Murdoch,
there's a bit of a twist here, because the very smartest people who I was with at Cambridge, who went into journalism, went into The Sun and the Daily Mail because they had already understood that the world was not quite as the establishment made it seem. And The Sun and the Daily Mail, and Scotland has the same with its red top titles like the Daily Record, do not buy the whole bandwagon. The Daily Record, for example, is not entirely pro-Scottish independence, not by a long chalk. The Sun and the Daily Mail routinely ask up-close and personal questions about the sexual proclivities of our great and good, and routinely will put out better infographics than the broadsheet titles equivalent to the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the New York Times, which simply give themes to think about for the intelligentsia.
Well, that's what we're going to see here. I think they did a great job on this reporting, and we're going to tip our hat to the young lady who did it. So let's go back to the deck. I've got a couple pages
let me just ask
from The Sun.
Quickly, if I could. Alex, in the United States, The Sun is owned by Rupert Murdoch. Is it as well in the UK?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, when I was just coming of age politically as a teenager, the big struggle of the time, the clash of the titans, was between Murdoch, who was spanning Britain, America, and Australia at that point, and Maxwell, of course, who is very much of interest to you on another strand, who'd come ultimately from Czechoslovakia. Incidentally, There's a credible claim by a man still alive who's sworn an affidavit to that effect, that Robert Maxwell's unacknowledged half-brother was a man called Stefan Adolphus Koch, who oversaw the political assassinations in the Margaret Thatcher government. It's not clear whether Thatcher herself signed off on them, mostly of people who were exporting British weaponry.
Wow. And of course, Rupert Murdoch is long friends with Robert Maxwell, pictured here fairly recently with Ghislaine Maxwell. We've spoken quite a lot about some of the weird reporting in Murdoch's New York Post and even on Fox News related to Jeffrey Epstein, but we digress for a moment. Back to John's deck.
Alex said the sun is echoing infographics.
Sorry, John, we're losing you there.
Data.
John, can you hear us? We lost you there for a second. You're back.
All right. So I'm finding that the Sun UK is putting out excellent infographics that are data-based, right? And one of them is where they're putting things in perspective regarding what is killing the most people in the UK, right? And what is happening right now versus the 5-year average. And this is the sort of thing I like to look at to get a sense of perspective. Where does COVID-19 fit in the grand scheme of things? And is the reaction commensurate with the threat, right? And
I do have to leap in although I'm not medical, I do have to leap in on that top item, dementia and Alzheimer's disease. A lot of UK column reporting through Brian Gerrish, who is our founding editor and takes the lead on a lot of the reporting on the underbelly of the health system, indicates that a decision has been taken across the British health jurisdictions, which of course are England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and further afield as well, Australia, Canada, to deliberately withhold food from and more particularly dehydrate a lot of elderly people, which produces symptoms akin to dementia. Some of the recordings of dementia, which probably put it up in top place there, may by this point be various forms of what are horribly called care pathways, which is a decision to kill people by withholding water.
Well,
and if some of your viewers might find that unbelievable, but it is absolutely spot on, and it is acknowledged. The phrase to search for is the Liverpool care pathway, which was an official scheme within the NHS for hastening the death of elderly people.
We just in one county in England, Cheshire, Dr. Mark Jones produced a whole bunch of people whose mothers were done to death that way, which you can find as a podcast still on the main front page of UK column. I think Feet of Clay and Clapping for the NHS, that podcast embedded in that. They're strong Northern English accents and a bad phone line, so you'll find it hard. But if you zip to the last half hour of that, Dr. Mark Jones himself, after presenting the ladies who spoke to him, he has a clearer voice and a better phone line, and he's very emotional, of course, but he's describing how the model works. And at the end, he specifically refers to how, I think it was, I forget which US channel it was, but very recently a US channel pointed out that the sum had been put of $1 trillion on the value of that death industry to the US, which is lawyers getting involved deliberately to dehydrate the vulnerable and steal their assets.
Boy, it sounds remarkably similar to what's been alleged here in New York State with Governor Andrew Cuomo moving the elderly into, kind of consolidating them with coronavirus patients.
That has been a particular Scottish lead, actually. There's been a lot of toing and froing that David can talk to briefly, I think, on the policy of sending, should we say, death trap COVID-positive patients back into care homes. Again, a Western world problem generally, but Scotland was in the lead there, I think.
Well, I mean,
it sounds to me like this is falling into motive. This is scary, creepy, getting into motive here behind, Jason, what we're seeing in the United States, which is remarkable death counts beyond what they're telling people on COVID. All right, so the number. If
Americans want to know what's going on, you can best look to Scotland and to Victoria, Australia, because those two are the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere laboratories for what will later be trialed in the US, I think.
Sorry to cut you off, David, but I want to make sure people understand that this could be the motive behind what's going on here, is what you guys are reporting. And this is why I wanted to get together with you guys, because you're sharing an aspect of the story that people in the States, I don't think they've heard this. So please go on, David, please.
Well, let me give you a couple of examples. One was from a large hospital in Lanarkshire in central Scotland. When the COVID crisis was just kicking off, The medical staff were all summoned into a room and they were briefed on the changes of policy. And the changes of policy were everyone over 45 was going to have a do not resuscitate notice posted into their file. So if you're over 45, that's you. Now, it was then followed up with don't tell the press. It was then followed up with if you leak this information, you won't have a job anymore. And remember, with the NHS in Britain, it's a monopoly employer. It employs something like 5% of the UK workforce. So if you're a medic and you lose your job with the NHS, you lose your career. So that's one data point. Another data point, another thing we've been informed of by very frightened medical personnel who won't go on the record because it means their career, is the pattern of seeding sick people with respiratory illnesses, COVID, influenza, what have you, into geriatric wards or into care homes. And this is simultaneously being done with the do not resuscitate notices, and do not resuscitate notices were giving out to entire populations of care homes in Scotland. I mean, everybody got one. We've reported in the column a letter given out to the relatives to explain why everyone in the care home had a do not resuscitate notice, and why if there was a problem requiring medical attention, no medical attention would be given. And so, as well as seeding illness into the care homes and into the geriatric wards, you had DNR notices, and you also had the removal of medical support. So if someone was ill in a care home, there would not be blue flashing lights. They would not be taken to hospital. The doctor would not attend. The doctor would phone and give the care home staff some advice, and that was the sum total of the care, of the medical attention given to that person. So we're looking at this very strange spike, which in the statistics, which happened after the lockdown. So it's after the rules came in, the deaths spiked, and they spiked dramatically. They spiked very late in the season for flu or any other respiratory illness, and they spiked very suddenly and declined very suddenly. None of it looks familiar. None of it looks like the sort of statistical signature of previous epidemics.
That's what we're going to talk about more. Yeah, we're going to talk about that because these patterns, I mean, if they stand out, if they're outliers, well, that matters, right? And we need to pay attention to that. So let's go to the next slide, Jason. Let's see what we've got next, because this is where we're going to get into the data. So this is where I went to your Public Health England, and I pulled down your reports.
So this is the body that the government has admitted is not fit for purpose. It has been massaging the figures.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness!
Do they know Fauci? Do they know that guy?
Come on. Yeah. So this is what it looks like, ladies and gentlemen, when the government puts out reports that are not fit for public consumption. These are those reports. So what they reported basically is an outbreak of influenza in the UK. All right. And what we want to look at is, while all the attention was over here on this shiny little COVID object, what was happening with influenza in the UK in February, March, April, May, June? What was happening? So let's go to the next slide. So this is what we have from Public Health England, and they're looking at all-cause mortality surveillance. And if you scroll down just a little bit more, Jason, on the right side of that chart, we got a big spike out there. And yeah, that looks like influenza. So yeah, let's just not talk about it and move on and ignore it and pretend that it's not there. So this is a major spike in weekly observed expected all-cause deaths and ages, and it's influenza, and it's this season, and it exceeds every previous year on the chart. So let's not talk about it. So let's go to the next page and see where this takes us. All right. In the U.S., we talked about this a second ago. When I make a dividing line at a certain age point, and we say, this is how many people died from this age and older, and this is how many people died younger. Let's go to the next page, Jason, because it gets more dramatic if I drop it by just 10 years. Okay, so what is this, Jason? What's the legend say? 0 to
54 years.
0 to 54, 54 and older. So in the United States, people who are 54 and younger, only 15,000 have died. The real number, David, this goes back to what you're talking about in Scotland. They're killing old people.
In fact, it's not just us saying this, because the Isle of Skye, well known to people around the world from the music and the songs about it, the Isle of Skye, or one of its main towns, Portree, has had a criminal case opened just this week that David may know more about, looking at this care home policy. People might not want to get their hopes up too much about the prosecutorial route, because Scotland has, like the DA system in the United States, an effective prosecutorial monopoly by an arm of the government, the Procurator's Fiscal. And in a particular case of the Isle of Skye, we had a policeman telling us a couple of years ago that when he went to serve a beat on that island for the first time, when he got a posting there, the prosecutor there, the Procurator Fiscal, summoned him in for a chat and said, "Let me give you the Skye book." This turned out to be the list of those who were above the law in his territory, which was the Isle of Skye. But that particular place has now got an investigation going.
Now, Alex, have I got the right Sky here from BBC? They're telling us in August that it was dropped.
That's correct, but I don't know what the latest is. I think David will be looking into it. But the Highlands and Islands of Scotland is a distinct area for population density and many other factors, lifestyle. And there's a lot of stuff coming out of there. And that reaches back, in fact, to the previous horror in Scotland, the named person scheme, because the trial for that, there were two counties that were trialed first, Fife and the Highland area. And the Highland area is now, well, it pioneered the named person scheme quite horrendously. There's a lot of data issues around how the council treats young people in Highland. So it seems to be very clustered. And in fact, just today we heard that Inverness, the only city in the Highlands, is clearing mental health people out and putting them in, I think, some kind of other clinic setting, I forget the details, in order to clear hospital beds for a second wave. It's remarkable how localized these things are sometimes.
Let me just, on that, just throw one other little data point on. I was speaking to a local nurse who worked in the local mental health hospital, and her speciality was people with drug and alcohol addiction and weaning them safely off their addiction. And her entire department was closed at the onset of COVID in order to clear the decks and create capacity for COVID nursing. And she just couldn't believe it. So everyone's been locked up. Drug and alcohol abuse are going to be going off the charts, and people are going to be deciding to come off these things without support. And I know that this will end up with more deaths, and no one's listening to me. So there's this huge pattern of decisions being made by the management levels within the NHS that the practitioners who actually know how to care for people look at and they cannot understand. It's the very reverse of what they see as obvious good decisions.
One of the articles, I think still on the main page there, the bottom there that you have open, Jason, is called Towards a Million Change Agents. We pinned it to the bottom of the page because it's a classic, I think, piece done for us, talking about the National Health Service. And yes, the National Health Service does have 1 million employees. It's in the top 5 of the world's employing organizations by number, up there with the US military and the Chinese military and so on. Indian Railways, I think, completes the set. And, James Dellingpole, a dissident commentator, noticed just this week that the National Health Service now employs more than 5% of either the national or even the working population. I forget which of the two it was, but the phrase he used was something like, it'll be sucking every penny out of the depleted tax coffers. And we see that with this concept, as we reported on UK Column News today, of it's the equivalent in national health triage of officer safety first. The whistleblowers coming from all over the British Isles are saying two things to us and other outlets. One, we're not allowed to say which parts of our hospitals are closed. That would give the game away. And
wow.
If I could remember a moment, the second one is, I think, the extent to which the National Health Service has been privatised behind the scenes, and the amount of mind control stuff going on.
Wow.
So yeah, this is a quotation that was taken from somebody within the efforts to reframe the National Health Service, when this got going. By the way, mental health services are crucial to this because they were one of the first areas privatised out of the National Health Service, which we were told in 1948 when the NHS was set up would never happen. But it started with mental health over a decade ago. But even when the non-mental health parts of the National Health Service were being reprogrammed, reframed, using some of the techniques John was mentioning earlier by new style trainers, there was this phrase being used: "I want all of you to be change agents."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now,
it's a common term.
Might seem unrelated, but we've heard recently, despite Boris Johnson's suggestion that he wanted to actually eliminate the mandatory TV tax, which basically pays for the BBC, instead, when he came out of hospital, the BBC announced that people over 75 now, for the first time, would be paying this annual tax. Is this an assault on the United Kingdom's elderly population?
It certainly went down that way because a dose of BBC for that generation is very much akin to their daily dose of medicine, at least in placebo terms. A lot of that generation can't do without it.
Yeah, it's played very badly. You'll find that in about one day out of every three, the phrase the hashtag defund the BBC is trending on British Twitter. They're becoming an organisation that is actually quite detested, so much so that the BBC are turning up to report on some protests, and the protesters really make it untenable for them because there's so much abuse coming towards the BBC reporters. They have to leave. So it's very strange that organisations like ourselves, we can go onto the streets and report on how people or what people actually think. The BBC are getting to a point where they can no longer do so. They have to stay in their ivory towers. They have to stay in their London Citadel and their Salford Citadel, because outside where the real people are, they are no longer becoming welcome.
The thought I couldn't quite remember a moment ago, which is relevant here, about officer safety, first and foremost, which is coming to US law enforcement, largely through overseas training of the US law enforcement branches, I think. That now has its corollary in the weaponized or militarized National Health Service, which is our contention is what it's becoming. Because, as I said a moment ago, James Dellingpole and others are saying, look, it's a bloated beast sucking the teat for all of the goodwill of many hundreds of thousands within it. It is collectively sucking a tax teat that is diminishing to zero over time with the demographic change. And the other thing I couldn't remember a moment ago, which whistleblowers from the National Health Service are keen to get out, which they're punished severely for if they're found, is talking about how some of their colleagues refuse to put the patient first, whether it's first responder paramedic settings or even police officers who, as we reported today and through this week, have been told not to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, even when they have knocked people over and concussed them. Only to give CPR, not mouth-to-mouth, because of COVID, of course. But this goes right through to nurses, and again, you'll find this in Australia and elsewhere, refusing to come near certain people unless they have guarantees of COVID-negative status or wearing masks. You can argue the ethics of it and the change over time, and everyone has a different threshold in healthcare for how much they wish to sacrifice themselves for the patient. I understand that, but there is a cluster of cases just this month, I think, of whistleblowers saying what is really shocking them is the new style. NHS middle management, in particular, are saying, as they have been doing to US law enforcement for some time, your safety comes first and foremost. When you interact with the public, the member of the public will die before you get into any risk.
Just to dip back to this, the image you were showing there, Jason, of the BBC headquarters at Bush House. I don't know if you can zoom in on the statue.
Oh, David Hawkins has mentioned this to date, Jason, I think, and he's also traced where the quote comes from. It comes from the Benedictine rule: obey. Yes. The first words of the Benedictine rite are in that open book.
So this is a statue, a very dodgy statue that looks very paedophilic, by a sculptor called Eric Gill, who sexually abused his two daughters and the family pet. So that's what adorns the BBC. They've just renovated the building, and it still adorns the BBC. So they're obviously quite pleased with it.
There we are, Obsculta, yes. Just to get Wales into this, we haven't mentioned Wales at all yet. The whole clique around Mr. Gill, then between the wars, decamped to what was then very rural and out of the way Wales. And in both the mainland and also on an island, Tenby Island, we've got a number of whistleblowers talking about this now, continued their jollies abusing children with the connivance of quite a few people. And the monks on Tenby Island are now completely locked down because of COVID fears. But they're very worried, or rather that the manager of the estate seems to be very worried that people might overfly that island and find out certain things about where children may have been kept. So Gil is not just historical, it's just that he and his clique went to out-of-the-way locations to continue what they did.
Sounds like Jeffrey Epstein, children on
Absolutely.
islands.
I've said to a couple of people who've contacted me about this, have we found Europe's Epstein Island? It's called Caldy Island, Caldey, reached only by a postal boat from the port of Tenby on the south coast of Wales. Caldy Island, and I'm not implying that the monks all know what's going on here. There is currently, according to my information, just 8 people on the island, and they've been told if you go to the mainland for shopping or healthcare, you will never come back. And the ostensible reason is COVID lockdown because of the elderly monks. But it seems they're very worried about being found. There's complete ban on overflights of the island, but I'm just going to put out there that it may be something that happens at some point. Somebody may overfly that island and find something in the 450 acres of woodland on the middle of the island that they don't like people to see.
Wow. We're far afield here. Sorry about that, John, but it's fascinating.
I thought I would get that in because you've been asking where Europe's Epstein Island is, and I think we found it.
Wow.
Interesting. That's an Abbey.
Amazing. Okay, back to the deck, John. Sorry about that.
All right. No, that's fascinating. All right, let's go to our next slide, which I think we're going to get into the comorbidities.
Yeah. Is it this one here?
Next one.
Sorry. Well, this is an even smaller section here, 0 to 44.
Yeah. So when you break it back down even further, right? So people who are 44 and younger. So what I'm getting at here is if you're in your 30s, if you're in your 20s, the likelihood of you dying of coronavirus in the United States is fairly low. And so these are the kind of statistic breakdowns, the categorical breakdowns that we've been doing to look at using the CDC's numbers, what's happening. And what we're seeing is consistent with this very upsetting behavior that David just described up in Scotland, which is it appears they're almost purposefully letting the older people die. And this is something that, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance around that, right? People are going to go, what? That's impossible until the evidence becomes overwhelming that that's what's happening. And, it sounds like you guys have crossed that tipping point.
Oh, yes, and just down the road from here in Belgium, where we had, I think, one of the world's highest COVID death rates.
Yes.
They have had mainstream press breaking cover now with their colleagues and saying, did we deliberately kill people in the care homes? And in fact, just this week, 200 doctors, just from the Flemish half of Belgium, because there's 2 language groups there, just the Flemish half, 200 doctors have penned an open letter, which is also available in English translation. If you just search for 200 Belgian doctors letter, you'll find it easily enough, I think. Pointing out that the pandemic is really a case-demic. So it's not just alternative commentators using this wry phrase now of case-demic. It's actually doctors themselves.
Interesting. Well, definitely Belgium has been on our radar for probably 6 months. Belgium's death rate for people who contracted it versus died was the highest in Europe outside of Andorra, which most people didn't even know was a nation. And so we had our eye on Belgium through the whole time and kept saying, what's going on in Belgium? Why is it so hot in Belgium? Why is everybody dying in Belgium? And it just didn't seem to make sense. And so we had our eye on Belgium for quite a while. Same thing with Iceland. Iceland had 10 deaths when Shanghai and Beijing had less. How does Reykjavik have more dead people than Shanghai on a virus that supposedly originated in Wuhan? That was causing cognitive dissonance for us and making us dig deeper. It's like, well, that there's
Iceland has about the same population as Fifth Avenue, doesn't it? 300,000 people.
Yeah, it's nominal. It's half of Alaska, and Alaska is 650,000 people, right? So Brooklyn is 5 times the size of Alaska, right? Brooklyn, New York is 5 times Alaska's size. So
Population-wise.
in population, yeah, in population. So the fact that Reykjavik, Iceland had 10 people dead when Shanghai and Beijing had so many fewer, just it didn't add up. It's like,
Of
how
course,
does
the
that
objection
happen?
will be raised, John, that we shouldn't trust the commie Chinese statistics.
And that's when we said, okay, let's go to Cambodia. Let's go to Laos. Let's go to Vietnam. Let's go to Mongolia. Let's go to nations that border China, and let's see what's happening there. Because if China's lying, well, Taiwan isn't, right? They hate each other, right? So Taiwan has 7 people dead, 24 million people living on an island, and 7 are dead. I mean, these numbers didn't make sense to us. And so we said, something is up here. This is not as it seems. And then when we started to look at the CDC's comorbidity data, the thing that jumped out was more than half these people are dying from influenza, it appears. They've got influenza and COVID, but if they've got H1N1, that's what's killing them, is that. Then, yes, there's a whole bunch of other comorbidities. And if you go to the next slide, I show the major ones, Jason. I break it down to the big ones on the next slide. Yeah. So these are the big comorbid. Now, this is in the United States. So you guys may see similar patterns or altogether different. But what they're doing here is categorically telling us, what is also killing people with COVID. So these are the comorbidities. And vascular dementia and sepsis and kidney failure, and then malignant neoplasms, that's cancer. So a malignant neoplasm is a cancerous tumor. So if somebody's got a cancerous tumor and COVID, that's counting as a COVID death. And then this category, intentional and unintentional injury, poisoning, and other adverse things. These are your motorcycle accidents.
That's a comorbidity, intentional injury?
Yeah, and
I guess if you're injured and dying and you're in the hospital, right? Yeah.
All right.
Two things about comorbidities. One is UK-wide. It's now been split up into the different nations, but UK-wide we used to have a standard form for death reporting on the certificates. It used to require 2 doctors. There used to be far more reasons for autopsy than there are now. This has all happened recently before the COVID outbreak or whatever it is, which is itself suspicious. But the old style, some of our family doctors still spent most of their career doing, was you would report the fatal causes first, and then in a separate section, sometimes with a different Roman numeral, the contributory causes. And that's we've seen a number of things. I mean, part of that horrible story I was mentioning a moment ago that Dr. Mark Jones brought out in the podcast with Brian Gerrish is it's the undertakers that notice the emaciated condition of the elderly and children. There's no more weighing of corpses at death, not just an autopsy. There's pressure and financial reward, often ghoulishly called ash cash, if a doctor will sign off for a cremation. These are some of the things that's going on. Financial nudges through the system, not just nudges in terms of behavior. That's a big thing. Britain now has the nudge unit, the behavioral insights team, which, by the way, during this pandemic, supposed pandemic, wrote that the British people were not yet afraid enough. We broke that story as well. A team called SPIB talked about that. But there's lots of nudges towards quick cremation, no weighing, no autopsy, particularly if they're after the assets. Legally, again, Britain has got non-common law categories of courts that have come in the last 20 years. The family courts have gone off the record in the sense that they're private. It's a serious criminal offence to report what goes on in these courts now. And then for the elderly, we have this thing brought in about 15 years ago called the Court of Protection, which seems to be where the lawyers reside who work out where the really juicy pickings are to declare the elderly or otherwise incapacitated people a ward of court. So it's very, very coordinated. We probably see more of it in Britain than you do in the States, breaking water, but I'm sure it's going on in the US in the same ways.
Wow.
Remarkable. Well, what we saw when I pulled your data from Public Health England, what I was attracted to, or what caught my attention, was that you were experiencing a rather significant outbreak of influenza as you approached the middle of February. And what we're seeing here on the chart, the week numbers, so between week 4 and 8, so we're in week 6 and 7, that's February. And so in February, you guys were in the high category. You were up in that pink zone, not quite in the purple, but higher than previous seasons. So this chart is showing us 2017, 18, 19, and this season was worse. So as the year began, you were in the midst of an influenza outbreak that was worse than either of the last two seasons. That's not a stretch. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's kind of factual based on what we're seeing from Public Health England, based on their data, right? So according to their data, you had more cases coming into week 6 and 7 than you had in the last 2 years of influenza. And then what happened? Let's see. Let's go to the next slide, Jason. Well, we come back to the Sun UK. And one of the things that the Sun UK has figured out is that more people were dying in the UK from the flu than from coronavirus. And this is consistent with what Jason and I have discovered in the United States, is that in Texas, in Florida, in California, more people were dying from the flu than
I think
from
we've
coronavirus.
discovered one of the reasons why the official feminist bandwagon has been screeching for a couple of years now that the Sun must be closed down. I mean, the ostensible reason was it's a misogynist newspaper. But a lot of the British intelligentsia have been making no secret for some time that they would like to see the Sun closed down.
Well, they're certainly not going along with the narrative here. Let's go to the next slide, Jason, and show what they show here, because this is powerful. What they're showing, they have charted the same data that I just downloaded. And what they're demonstrating is that the COVID deaths, although they did peak back in April, that since June, more people were dying in the UK from influenza than from coronavirus. Since June, July, August, September. For all this time, with all the panic that they're shoving in your face, more people were dying from influenza. But it seems nobody knows that except for a handful of people, right?
Help me out here, David, but I haven't heard any reporting on influenza being of concern from the British media at all this year. Have you?
No. This is. I mean, I caught this report from the Sun, but that was about it. That was the outstanding element. The broadsheet papers really haven't covered this at all.
Let's go to the next slide. So again, tip of the hat to the Sun UK. They have been tracking COVID deaths per day, and this is the only metric that I'm interested in at the moment. Yes, cases can be a leading indicator, but not if you know how to treat the damn thing effectively. If you do your job right, nobody should die, like in Cambodia and in Laos and in Mongolia, where no one's dead, right? So if you do your job right, no one dies.
At the other end of the scale, we have Northern Ireland, which early in this year, as one of the early stages of response, decided that you would need to make an appointment to go to the emergency room, or accident and emergency, as we call it in Britain. That's not going to do much good for the deaths figures, is it?
Yeah, it's tough to do from the back of an ambulance. Call ahead. Can I get a time? Well, we'll just hang out here in the ambulance for a couple hours, no problem. So so here's what we're seeing in the UK. Your deaths per day, September 14th, you had 5 people die. 5. And you're going to lock you're locking yourselves down again?
Or take the Republic of Ireland. I'm looking here at page 11 of a document which has been covered by your namesake, David Cullen, who has the Computing Forever channel. And he and John Waters, a good ally of ours, have pointed to page 11 of this document, COVID-19 Daily Epidemiology Report, NPHET. Maybe Jason can look for the phrase Table 7 Summary of All Deaths in COVID-19 Cases Notified in Ireland, up to midnight 02/09/2020. And there you've got 1,777 total number of deaths as up to the beginning of September, of whom precisely all but 100, so 1,677, are listed as number with underlying clinical conditions. So 100 out of 1,777 had no recorded comorbidities. But significantly, I think John Waters and Dave Cullen were most interested by this, and Dave has put out a video about it on the Computing Forever channel. There is no breakdown of what those comorbidities were, nothing about accurate symptoms, nothing about autopsies, and that's probably deliberate. And more particularly, the 100 who died with no comorbidities, no age breakdown. Were they young and significant or surprising deaths, or were they elderly and, sorry to say, but less surprising deaths? One further thing about the Republic of Ireland, the HSE, which is the overall healthcare body in Ireland now, again, new style, careless, uncaring kind of healthcare that's come in the last few years. That HSE organisation had British and particularly Scottish leadership imported into it to be change agents, to change the culture. And this was with regard to the state child theft, as well as the pushing of vaccines. You know, they had a big HPV scandal with teenage girls in Ireland, some of them being crippled by it. All of this happened with new management. And the more that the Irish and Scottish governments wave nationalist flags and say that they're never going to be ruled by London, the more these London figures come over, it seems, and run persistently.
The figure, John, you were showing there for the UK, 41,700. The good news is, of course, it was over 46,000 deaths in the UK, and they've revised the number downwards because the way they were counting was that anyone who had a positive COVID-19 test and then died at any point in the future for any reason was counted as a COVID-19 death, and the errors were getting too grievous, so they had a correction to that. And there's more recently has been a correction in some figures in Scotland as to people who
I don't think your countrymen understand that less than 10 people are dying a day right now. Less than 10 people a day.
The number of patients in hospital with COVID in Scotland was reported as 262, and that number was reduced to 48 overnight when they corrected the figures, right? Because they were counting everything. Right.
So less than 10 people are dying, but they're going to keep showing you case counts and hospital beds and hospital sheets and hospital cases blankets
going up.
Cases and masks, and we're running out of masks, and we don't have enough vaccines, and we don't have enough test kits, but nobody's dying. If less than 10 people
are dying,
this
chart, guys, look at this. So this is if you just look up death rate on, I don't even know where this data is coming from. It's some Google presentation, but it defaults to new cases, which is spiking upward. But deaths has been flat since August 2nd.
You don't have 10 people dying a day in the UK, right? I mean, that's one lorry accident, and you got 10 dead. You don't have 10 dead a day from this, and you're going to lock yourselves back down?
And look at John with the British
the size of the country is such. Yeah, the size of the country is about 1,600 people a day die in the UK. So from
typical things, meaning from heart attacks and strokes and things like that.
Yes, from the things that people always die of.
Right.
And so that you're saying it's not 10. Yeah, this is correct. But you also have to put it into the context of against what background, what scale are we talking about? It's not
against April.
It's not 10.
I'm talking about against April and May. So people were conditioned by this NLP-like media storm that this is the worst pandemic. You're at risk. Your family's at risk. Put your mask back on, or your kids could die. We're going to kick you off the airplane if your kid takes a mask off. Your 2-year-old takes off the mask. They're going to kick you off the plane, right? This is the worst thing. And it's not getting better. It may be getting worse. And we're going to lock you down again because we think it's getting worse. Can't be based on how many people are dying. And this gets back to sort of my background in, the basics of management and data and systems is, well, what is it that you want to measure? And are you measuring the right things? Is measuring miles per hour and RPM
this Irish epidemiology report is a classic of what not to measure or how to under-measure. If Jason scrolls down to that page 11 of that, you will find, big questions about why those recorded as having comorbidities when they died of COVID are not broken down for what symptoms they had. It seems not even the hospitals are recording the symptoms in many cases, perhaps on command. And how recent is this change of policy is the question there.
Well, gentlemen, let's get back to the deck because we are getting close on time here. I want to make sure we stay on track.
All right. So this is a story from The Sun. Flu and pneumonia are killing 10 times more people than COVID, which claimed 78 lives last week. So 78 last week is about 11 a day. We just looked at the last couple of days. You don't even have 10 per day anymore. So at some point, when you've got less than 10 people a day dying in your country, how many more weeks and months do you need to wear masks and continue to panic everybody and stay 6 feet? What is it, 6 meters, 6 feet, whatever it is? All these rules and regulations and the violations of your rights when less than 10 people were dying from something. Once upon a time, this may have been a global pandemic, but not in the UK. Now, there's something called situational leadership, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term, but situational leadership means we have different circumstances in different places, and different management techniques are needed. So what's happening in the UK and what's happening in India right now are not the same thing. India is on fire. More people are dying every day in India than the day before. That's not good, right? So India and the UK are not at the same stage in this outbreak. And that's important for people to understand. We are not minimizing coronavirus. We're not making fun of it. There's people dying from it, just not in the UK. Not in the UK. Not more than 10. Not more than 10 a day in the UK are dying right now.
And we should say for those who doubt that there is such a thing as some horrible respiratory disease that's unprecedented affecting people, we are seeing that. Acquaintances of mine, just in this area, the Rotterdam area in the Netherlands, have been admitted, young and old, this year. And hospitals have been shocked at the horrendously messy lung x-rays that are coming out for these patients. I have to put that in there because we do see a contingent of our viewers who say there is no COVID. I can just about understand as a rhetorical argument, but that there is nothing, that is a step too far. I think John is making that point very eloquently. There is something very horrible going on.
Yes. My concern, though, is that it's something that happened with my daughter, and I brought her into the hospital, and I thought it was one thing, but it was something else that looked like the other thing. And I'm wondering how much of that is happening here, where because of all the panic, when someone goes into the hospital with a cough, with congestion, with a fever, it's immediately we're COVID. Yeah. We've been programmed, right? We've been programmed that we're looking for COVID. Oh my God, it could be COVID. And we test for COVID. But might they also have H1N1 in addition to COVID? Well, in the United States, the answer to that question is yes, because more than half of the deaths had influenza. Now, do I know it was H1N1? No. But from the doctors' reports that we've heard about the blue lips, the oxygen depletion, and what you just talked about, the quality of the lungs, this is all consistent with the Spanish flu. This is absolutely the same as the Spanish flu. And that's what Jason and I have been studying is Spanish flu outbreak versus coronavirus, and how many of these symptoms that we're hearing described, this cytokine storm and the lung condition, are actually consistent with the Spanish flu outbreak. So let's go to the next slide, Jason. This is your data mart on what happened with influenza, and all of a sudden you were having this big bad outbreak, and then something remarkable happened that it wasn't so bad anymore. And we just looked at a slide before where it looked kind of bad, and then it just kind of stopped. And wow, that's remarkable. So whatever you guys did.
This is mid-March, right? Just when the lockdown was declared. Yeah.
Remarkable. So all of a sudden your influenza problem. We have
the opposite side of that graph. UK Column has been putting out a graphic that's gained some traction, showing that lockdown deaths is most of the hump that follows the proclamation of lockdown.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned. All right. So let's go to the next slide. All right. So this is daily deaths in the United Kingdom. This is the truth. These are the facts. This is what's happening. Forget about hospital beds. Forget about testing. Forget about cases. Forget about test kits. How many people are dying? And I want to make sure that the people of the UK are setting policy and are holding their leaders accountable to the facts of today, not the facts of 6 months ago. The facts of 6 months ago were tragic, and the facts of today are actually optimistic. This is good news. I'm sorry to report. We have good news. Now, that may not be consistent with the narrative that whoever's behind the BBC wants out there at the moment, but if only 5 people died last Friday in the UK, help me understand how we're not on the right trajectory here.
And if you apply to that graph a little arrow that says this is when masks were made mandatory, which is the 24th of July,
right,
you'll see just how insane that decision was.
It has absolutely no correlation with the reality of the data. And again, this is why people keep saying, why do you keep bringing up Mongolia? Why do you keep bringing up Laos? Why do you keep bringing up these other weird countries that you're not part of the normal conversation? It's because if you think no one is dead in Mongolia because of their adherence to mask wearing and social distancing, you don't understand what's happening. There's no one dead in Laos, not because of masks. That wasn't the secret. People don't get that now. 6 months later, 9 months later, you don't understand that there's no one dead in Cambodia from coronavirus. It's not because of the masks. It's not because of social distancing. It's something else. And if it's something else, our leaders they've got to figure out, well, what is it if it's not the masks?
All three of those Asian countries you mentioned are recent emergents from communism, and their healthcare staff are not yet well paid enough, and certainly not under enough layers of new think management as the Western healthcare systems are to manipulate the figures. They're still in the communist or post-communist mode of write down what you're supposed to write down, right? There isn't that sophistication of the
Jason and I say they didn't get the memo. They're not in the clique. They don't get the memo that says, all right, as of week 11, here's what's going on. And the guys in Cambodia, it's the same thing in Africa. We've been looking at Nigeria, at Ethiopia to see what's happening there.
Countries with massive populations and
200
where people
million.
Tend to congregate very closely together.
200 million
but
people
wait a minute,
in Nigeria.
Guys. There's another important factor. The countries that you're mentioning, irrespective of their populations, are dramatically less important in terms of their per capita income or their overall economies than some of the countries. I mean, certainly the United States, largest economy in the world, hardest hit. I'm not saying there's a correlation, but
very base heavy, not top heavy, as first world countries are.
Indeed. Well, here's sort of the final straw to this thing that I think really made Jason and I upset was a couple months ago when we figured out that the World Health Organization just stopped reporting on influenza on a global basis. And we said, well, wait a second. I mean, if you get a new cat, you don't stop feeding your dog, right? You can't do that. And if there's an influenza outbreak going on around the world and it is killing people, and we're in the midst of it, you're just going to stop reporting on it? How do you explain that, Dr. Tedros? So let's go to the next slide, Jason. I want to just kind of bounce through these. This is, what's that, Italy? Italy was having an H1N1 outbreak, and miraculously by week 11, it was over. We go to the next country, and in France, they were having an H1N1 outbreak, and by week 11, miraculously, it ended. And you see how there's nothing since then. Nothing. Nothing.
These are extremely dodgy graphs, to use a bit more British vernacular.
Indeed. And very, very dodgy is quite polite. This is the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and you were about to experience the binodal second hump when the call came in week 11. And Jason and I have been talking about week 11. Week 11 is when the call went out, but not to Cambodia, not to Laos, not to Burma. They didn't get the call. But the World Health Organization completely stopped reporting on influenza. This is the Netherlands where you are. Go back to the Netherlands. So What? How does it just go from sky high to gone in 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
I'm
How did
stunned
that?
by that. I right here in the Netherlands, pretty much in the heart of society, geographically in the middle of the country, lots of contacts, different walks of life, lots of medics talking to me. I didn't have a clue from media or general personal contacts that there was such a wave of influenza in the country.
And
the
how
Netherlands, which I think
remarkable
has
it
the best
just
healthcare system in the world,
look at how
and
it
the most
stopped.
transparent, and what the hell's happened to it?
Remarkable. I mean, you guys just shut it down like you had a flamethrower, like you just and it stopped. Incredible. Let's go to Lithuania. In the midst of an H1N1 outbreak in Lithuania, which is not far from you, right? It's a little bit east of you.
It's tied into us by the EU. We have a lot of Lithuanians here as guest workers, so there's lots of mixing of populations.
Yeah, I mean, border-wise, Netherlands and Lithuania, I mean, it's
there's no border controls. You're a citizen of one, you can travel to the other.
Yeah, and they're right near each other. But you're in the midst of an H1N1 outbreak in Lithuania, and then no more
Moreover,
reporting.
they're in the same climatic and demographic zone of Europe, so you would expect very similar population behavior.
Now, Turkey has about the same population as Germany, about 85 million, give or take. They're in that 85, 90 million range. Turkey was in the midst of an H1N1 outbreak, and World Health Organization...
They gave up week 6 to destroy Libya.
Week 5. Yeah, week 5 was it. So that's the first week in February. The WHO had already stopped collecting data on influenza that if it's an outbreak of H1N1, if this is a Spanish flu outbreak, it killed 50 million, 100 million people 100 years ago when the population was a fraction of what it is now. These are some of the projections that I found looking around, and it's remarkable. I mean, to me, this is fake news. When I see a projection like this showing here's where we think is going to happen if you don't wear masks, and if you do wear masks, and if you stay socially distant, how any of this is based on anything other than the fact that only 5 people died in the UK yesterday. This is nonsense. This is an example of what you guys were talking about. This is how you condition the public using fake information. This is just remarkable to me. We'll go to the next one. There's a couple examples of this.
It's very effective as well, because human beings are quite prone to it. With a background in structural engineering and technical matters, I'm only too painfully aware of where this can go wrong. There was a mathematician called Alfred North Whitehead who coined a phrase for it. He called it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which he defined as the error of confusing a model with the reality it's purporting to describe.
I was thinking of something very similar, again from the Scottish Enlightenment, actually, or from that mode of thinking, which is you used to know until very recently, certainly in a Scottish university training, and particularly for medicine, but for other subjects as well, that in order to conclude that X had caused Y, you didn't need just to have sufficient proof that X had caused Y, but you also needed to be able to demonstrate that X had necessarily caused Y. Mm-hmm. And that's the foundation of Enlightenment logical thinking. But it's perhaps no surprise that that's gone by the board. This is, after all, the week when the David Hume Tower at Edinburgh University has been renamed.
Oh, boy. Don't tell me it's George Floyd Tower.
Well, you're not far away. The reason it's been renamed is because our 17th century philosopher, 18th century philosopher said some things about other races that are no longer deemed acceptable.
Oh, okay. So back in the 1600s, and we're going to resolve that now. Good. This is a good time for that. All right, let's go to the next slide, Jason. We'll wrap it up in just another couple slides. So yeah, these projections, this is like you said, David, it's very effective. This is how they scare the hell out of the public. It looks real official, looks great, but that's not what's happening, right? I've been around data for 35 years and sophisticated systems, and this is not the future, folks. These projections, this is just absolute fallacy. And it's criminal. Like you said, the suicide rates are up. People are killing themselves. People have lost their jobs. They can't pay for their houses. right? People,
And
this is
just today,
tragic.
the Scottish government put out a YouTube video to people, basically telling them to expect to be mentally disturbed as a result of the situation they're in right now.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. Just
let me give you a little example. I was speaking to one mother who'd lost her son, aged about 18, and he'd gone to university, and she was aware that he wasn't coping well with new life, and he'd been to the doctors, and he'd been put on some sort of medication, mental health medication. She was so terrified of COVID and of COVID coming back from the big city and her own health conditions, and COVID was such a big threat. She kept her distance from her own son.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't realize how bad he was. She didn't realize how desperate the situation was. And tragically, the young man, after appealing several different times to the health services for help, took his own life. And she's left with, if only I had done something differently. No. It's a pitiable situation, and it was certainly contributed to by the lockdown.
I hope we reach one family.
Mm.
So, John, what happens when COVID?
The one thing I think we've learned above all else, if I may just a moment, is in all of this campaigning, we don't have a shortage of insightful, intelligent people offering to help, but we do have a shortage of stability of character. It's what we keep finding on all our campaigns and reporting strands. And one viewer put it to me very eloquently. He said, it's not enough for you to have an intellect to go into a battle like this. You need the intuition to be in tune with the intellect before you say anything. If it isn't, you're just wasting your time. But if it is, you may reach people.
Oh, I'm hoping we do. I'm hoping we reach people and people say, wait a second, this is not as bad as I'm being told. It's not.
Particularly families who will use their intuition, not just their intellect, to work out what to do with their suffering relatives.
Indeed.
It's fairly remarkable to note, John, that, even just talking about this, we are at risk of some various social media companies saying, you're questioning public health. You're not allowed to question science. You have to absculta. You have to listen and obey. But here we see one of the largest newspapers in England, The Guardian. We always talk about The Guardian. They're asking what happens when flu meets COVID-19.
And I would argue that the group that you've assembled here represents experts in the field. And our opinions, right, about this tragedy and our analysis of the data given our collective experience is absolutely relevant. And there's no harmful intent here. We're only trying to help. I mean, if this isn't the most altruistic group of four men that are trying to help people we've never met.
YouTube doesn't care about altruism. They just want to stomp on the truth.
Well, that's not going to work out well for them. That's just not going to work out, I promise. So now what I expect you guys are going to start to see in the UK is more of this twin-demic nonsense. Now this is the baton zone. So the baton is going to pass from COVID to the flu right before your eyes over the next 10 days because no one is dying in the UK of COVID anymore. If you've got less than 10 people dying a day now, which is what you do, you've got less than, that's a fact, whether YouTube likes it or not, less than 10 people are dying a day in the UK, period. That's according to the UK's Ministry of Health or what have you. So if that's the case, they can't continue the charade much longer, right? As you guys were pointing this out, right? You in Scotland, you rose up, you caused change. The people said, wait a second, this will not stand. Well, we're at that point now where they can't maintain the charade if only 5 or 3 people are dying a day.
But
so what they're going to layer on the influenza, and you're going to have a nice twin-demic.
But it's interesting, John, because you're talking about perpetuating a charade. And I mean, we're talking about truth, we're talking about fake news. I just want to examine logic for a moment, because this headline or the subheadline is saying, they don't know how these seasonal viruses might interact. It might lessen the pandemic, it might increase the pandemic, so you better take a vaccine. Because obviously we've got a binary situation where one outcome is desirable and the other is undesirable. And since we don't know what will happen, you better do something. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and the vaccine, remember, Dr. Fauci, we heard last week, Dr. Fauci said, I had the flu this season. So did he take the vaccine and it didn't work, or did he not take his own vaccine?
You have the Bank of England on screen, or as our absent colleague David Ellis likes to call it, their bank in England, because it's neither English nor a bank. David, help me out here. Didn't the Bank of England recently have some pronouncement about COVID on banknotes that made them appear more like a public health agency than a creator of money out of thin air?
That's the one.
Yeah, I think they said something about it. I vaguely remember it. I can't recall any better than you can, unfortunately.
Well, so I want to wrap up with this.
The point you make about people coming together because they understand the numbers is very interesting. Right? The joke in the UK is that doctors and members of the medical profession don't understand statistics. They don't understand numbers at all.
Right.
The only numbers they understand are the numbers that come between the word Mercedes and the letters SLK. Okay, that's right. And there is an element where this is often true, because you have people in positions like chief medical officers, and looking at their background, there's certainly nothing there to suggest that they have a firm grasp of statistics. And the way that people who work with stats all the time and data all the time will be able to look and analyze a situation and take from it some degree of what you might term truth. It is not unique to the medical profession, almost the reverse. So you're looking at people in other professions who are used to dealing with data, who need to be listened to and need to speak out when they see that the policy and the reality are no longer hanging together.
Exactly. And you're absolutely right. If there's people in the audience who are listening to us talking about these statistics and stuff, and they're like, man, I'm lost at minute 3 as these guys are going into these numbers, that's normal, right? People who do this stuff with numbers and make charts like I do, this is not typical. Most people aren't that comfortable with this stuff. I've just been doing it for a long time, and I'm trying to make the statistics visual using these charts so that people can quickly figure out what's what, right? What's bigger, A or B? Is one bigger than the other? Which one seems to be worse than the other? And let the audience draw their own conclusions from their official data. And that's one of the things I love about your research and the way you guys operate, is that you're doing very much the same thing we're doing, which is using their information to illuminate the hypocrisy. And
two things, I think: hypocrisy, and as you were mentioning a moment ago, John, this curse on public life of be seen to be doing something rather than nothing. To the extent that Edinburgh has a very grand main railway station, Waverley, and there was a photograph in there that we covered, I think just a week ago on David's segment. Network Rail, or ScotRail, I think, had put up a sign saying, "Keep your distance from other passengers to control viruses and bacteria." People have written to, I think it was ScotRail, wasn't it, to say, which bacteria did you have in mind here? It was just a filler word to make things sound grander and more shocking. Sure.
I mean, again, a scared populace is really easy to control. And again, this is such a remarkable study on population control and civilization management. And again, this group hypnosis concept. And when I saw the article from the Bank of England and that they're considering going to negative interest rates, it's something that I brought forward a couple months ago on the show with Jason. And I said, if the president of the United States wants to win re-election, the simplest way to do it is this. You want to win re-election, it's super, super, super simple. You announce an executive order that for small businesses and for families, that find themselves upside down and inside out, whether it's mortgages, car payments, whatever it is, you can borrow from the Bank of England at a negative percentage. So if you need 10,000, you're going to pay back 9,800. If you need 20,000, you'll pay back 19, whatever it is. And this allows the government to help its people without necessarily giving out handouts. A negative interest rate, over the course of time means you'll pay back less than you actually borrowed, but not by much.
I wonder whether we still have the money for this, because as we reported this week, a consortium of largely hedge funds, as I recall, has told the public and the government that we're going to have to spend £100,000 million to resume normal lives. So a price tag has been put on that. We've been held to ransom for that amount. And even a supposedly wealthy country like Britain, I don't think can afford, on top of that, to be helping people to borrow money for productive purposes.
Well, and the Bank of England's policy has been essentially to fund the entire British state, essentially by just printing money and lending it at close to zero interest rate.
Right, that's what we do.
Because they have there's a UK government overdraft with the Bank of England called the Ways and Means Fund. This was made unlimited, and they've not even touched it yet, because the bank is out there front running the government, buying government debt just slightly faster than the government is issuing it. So the government's able to borrow at a fraction of a % interest rate all the money to run the entire state at the moment, because the Bank of England's printing it. So it's monetization of the debt. It's just with a few intermediaries in there to conceal what's really happening.
So given that there is no gold standard, given that the money is virtually worthless, why not? Why not help everybody out?
This
The
is
Bank
why
of England loses 3% or 5%, or they go upside down by 5%. So what? If every restaurant, if every cafe, if every small business had the ability to borrow £100,000, £50,000, £250,000 to get back into business, and maybe to not make their first loan payment for 9 months or a year, so that they have a chance to get back on their feet, wouldn't that give the government the opportunity to fund the rebirth, the regeneration of the country? And again, people have been paying taxes. You guys have been paying taxes your entire adult lives. This isn't a handout. You funded this government. You built all that stuff. And now we've got a remarkable situation where the government needs to help the people. It just doesn't know how to do it effectively. And the most effective way it can do it is a very simple way. What does everybody need? Money. It's all it is. Everybody needs money. If they got money, they can buy their drugs. They can get their health care. They can do everything they need to do if they've got the money.
Well, and if you invert that, John, if people don't have money by design or by appearance, then they have problems. So if you wish to create problems, you attack
take away the money. Exactly.
This is to discuss issues like this is why we started the Deconstructing the Magic Money Tree series in the UK column. We were struck with the government announcement in the middle of the COVID shutdown, where we had managed to reduce our economy by 20 to 30%, in a retraction, worse than the Great Depression by a very substantial margin. The announcement was, we're going to build. The government said we're not going to have any more austerity. We're going to build, and it's going to be government spending that will get us out of this. There's a strange thing, because the background to this is they had suspended taxation collection in the UK, so no money was coming in.
Right.
They weren't borrowing in the open market, because essentially the Bank of England was providing all the liquidity the government needed.
Sure.
And we're thinking, okay, so we've got and government expenditures went through the roof. They were paying salaries to a third of the workforce in the UK. Sure. So expenditures are through the roof, income's gone to zero. We're borrowing everything, and the response is, "Hey, we're going to spend more." This struck us as very odd. So the question is, where that goes is the destruction of the currency, and it did occur to us. Well, wait a minute. if they've already decided the currency is going to go down. If they knew, what would you do? Well, you'd spend like it was going out of fashion, because it literally is.
If that's what you wanted, you might have spent the last 10 years, like certain Rockefeller foundations did, talking about resets. And I think you know the PDF I'm talking about, which has these forecasts and scenarios in it as to how many people will live happily under the cosh and how many will become dissidents.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think that the expectation I have is further fear, uncertainty, and doubt from the press in the UK. They're going to layer the influenza outbreak on top of you literally this week. Like you're going to, I mean, literally it's going to happen as we're going to hang up on this call. And within hours, you guys are going to start to see influenza. You're going to be like, this is bizarre. And it's because nobody's dying of COVID anymore in the UK. Or when I say nobody, less than 10 a day, right? To me, that's below statistical significance at this point. If we've got less than 10 a day, you're out. You guys cleared it. You're done.
In a population of supposedly 65 million, more like 75 in practice.
Exactly. And so, again, just to wrap this up, I believe if your leadership wants to help the common man, if they want to help the families, if they want to help small businesses, the guy who owns the pub, the guy, the small publishers, the dressmakers, these people need to get back in business. But
do they want to help those businesses, though, John? Well, has a decision been taken that small businesses are unsustainable? I mean, some of the reporting we've done from civil service insiders anonymously has said that there have been people rubbing their hands in the corridors of government in London, no doubt in other countries as well, saying, whoopee, the half of the economy we don't want to see survive can now be shut down much more easily.
Well, if that's the case, then we're shining a light on them at the same time, and it will become obvious, right? So, again, this comes back to something that Edward Snowden said the other day about censorship on YouTube. When you take off the videos of ISIS killing people, when you take those off of YouTube and people can't see that, well, now people don't understand how horrifying ISIS is. And by covering it up and hiding it, well, what do we show? What don't we show? It's a very, very tough decision, right? I mean, at some point, well, if we're going to leave the ISIS films on, then what about snuff films? Can you kill a cat and kill a dog and put that on YouTube and that's okay? Where do we draw the line on this stuff? And having the dialogue like this and letting an audience of hundreds or thousands of people hear this type of dialogue and then using their intuition, saying, wait a second, have I been lied to by the BBC? Have I been lied to by the people I've trusted for years? And all of a sudden a group of researchers have come together and have shown us information that leads us to believe this is possibly the greatest global cover-up. I mean, what compares to this in our lifetimes? I mean, maybe before we all were born, but I don't know of anything. David, I'm guessing you and I are probably the two oldest guys here. In our lifetime, can you think of anything this global in scale, a cover-up of this nature? This type of hysteria.
You're right. That's the difference. That's why this is different from things that have gone before, because the decisions have been made on a global basis. The decisions have been made in global institutions. Those institutions are entirely opaque in how they're run and funded, and the people who are influencing those decisions are not elected. They're not selected. They're not responsible. They can walk away if the decisions are bad. It's a very potentially toxic system, and we see it's extremely effective in putting its policies into every nation, into every aspect of our lives, however private, whether it be how we bring up our children, how we look after our granny, whatever it whatever it happens to be. Those policies are being passed down to our apparent elected representatives, but they're not being made there. They're being made at an international and global level.
Alex, have you seen anything like this in your years? I mean, back at GCHQ, as far as a cover-up of this scale, something this global with millions dead. I mean, they're just telling us coronavirus is 1 million, and we're just scratching the tip of it with the influenza, right? No, they haven't. Now you see the WHO stopped counting influenza. So how many are dead from influenza globally that no one knows about? Is it 4 million, 5 million, 8? I don't know.
Even within single ideological blocks, the Five Eyes countries with the very close intelligence partnership, all previous controversies, there was at least one member of those 5 English-speaking nations inside the club that would resile or dissent politely but firmly from consensus, from groupthink on certain matters. But groupthink is a key aspect of what's gone wrong with managerialism now. People who have only been trained from college upwards or even from school upwards to go along with the group. I was a criminologist that was one of the old, of course I post-date the Soviet Union in my career, but that's the label given to someone watching the Eastern Bloc, as was. And the thing that strikes me from that experience is, in its heyday, the Soviet Union could not even coordinate the policies within its own 15 republics within its own state, let alone the penumbra, the satellite states. There was always a dissident country on matters of health crisis or military response or what have you. The speed of it is quite something. And, I think if you go down to the very bottom of that page, Jason, there's an interesting angle on that for people. A charity which pretends to be independent from the BBC, called BBC Media Action, is getting into these countries, in this case Kazakhstan in Russia's underbelly, a former Soviet republic, and through media, and particularly soap opera in this case, is training the next generation of intellectuals and professionals to accept that there are new values in the new world, and that loyalty to your own cadre internationally and to the faceless men of that cadre trumps loyalty to your own people and their elected representatives.
The Kazakh steppe may be the largest oil repository that's yet to be tapped in the world right now. Right, so the Kazakhstan is sitting on possibly the largest untapped oil reserve.
I'll tell you something. You might just have explained to me.
That too. Yeah.
You might just have explained to me why Prince Andrew in the mid-2000s was making very frequent trips to Kazakhstan. Yeah. We in the intelligence agencies were seeing the telegrams come through from the Foreign Office. Prince Andrew will be making another visit to Kazakhstan next month. His visit is not official, no coverage. Of course, afterwards, this was tied to his sexual fall from grace, or possibly his links to tycoons. But I always thought there was more to it than that, because at the time he was Britain's official roving trade ambassador.
That sounds like a good reason to entrap him in a sexual scandal as well.
And I think you've just provided the raison d'etre for the entrapment, which is a level of hierarchy people haven't looked at much.
There's a significant oil reserve there in Kazakhstan, and they produce a fair amount of oil now, right? There's wealth in Kazakhstan, and the wealth in Kazakhstan is mostly tied to oil.
It keeps changing name. That capital city is very New World Order in its architecture and layout. It's like Asia's Washington.
There's 2 major cities. One is
Almaty in the southeast, the old capital, and the new one has gone through various names: Akmola, Astana, and most latterly Nur Sultan, I think.
Yeah, I know it is Astana. Yeah, Astana and Almaty are the 2 major cities in Kazakhstan. And from in America, the movie Borat, everybody thinks that Kazakhstan looks like the hills of Romania or something, but Almaty is looks like Denver, Colorado. I mean, it's got modern architecture, and it's like a serious city. So,
and this one that Jason's putting on the map is the brand new capital, Nur Sultan. It's built in a area that's parts of the western US are the same. Absolutely freezes at night and in the winter. Absolutely boils on a summer day. Right. Nobody thought of putting a city there. The old name Akmola actually means white shrine or white tomb.
Okay. And this is Astana? It's the same as Astana, right? This is Astana.
Yes, exactly. This is Astana, yeah. Almaty is almost on the very edge of the country and is in a much more temperate, hilly area. And that's where the Russians built a beautiful colonial city in the 19th century. But this city is very worrying. It's the geographical and economic pivot that I think is intended for Asia when Asia gets integrated into the New World Order as an economic bloc, along with Europe, which is destined to control Africa, and Russia, I think, is the plan they have in mind. And,
well, we certainly send a lot of astronauts into space from the Cosmodrome is in Kazakhstan.
At the moment, the US has no capacity to service its own space station. It requires the Russian Space Agency. You know, all this poo they throw at the Russians in propaganda.
Conducted the first.
That's private.
Commercial.
But that's private.
Well,
but that's
it's
private.
an asset. They can be used.
The government of the United States, NASA, doesn't have an ability to get to the space station. We can't get our guys up there. We literally send them to Kazakhstan and launch them from Kazakhstan.
Maybe you should ask your famously wonky German allies whether they have an undeclared launch capacity using unconventional means, because one of the things Gorbachev blew the whistle on in one of his fits of pique is that the Germans off the state in the Congo, actually, through corporate channels, had got a space, a territory that was doing space research.
So they have launch capability from the Congo. From the Congo.
Well, they did the research there. It's very equatorial, which of course is useful for launch. Nobody controlled it.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, this conversation has been absolutely fascinating, and I think we're going to need to invite David and Alex back again, but we are definitely out of time. Sorry to cut things short here, but I want to make sure that our viewers know they can get news daily from UK Column by visiting ukcolumn.org, and you can also check out the various YouTube channels, including Northern Exposure. You can see it right there. People can follow Alex on his YouTube channel, and of course, the John E. Hoover YouTube channel. You're going to see simulcasts of our YouTube videos there, as well as John's amazing research. Gentlemen, I want to thank each of you for this really informative review of the information, and we're going to have to keep our eyes open for influenza data. Gentlemen, have an excellent evening wherever you are in the world. I'll speak with each of you soon, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Al. Really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Likewise. And thanks everybody for watching. I want to remind people that they can see John Cullen Investigates every Friday on patreon.com/IamJohnCullen, subscribestar.com/IamJohnCullen. People can support Crowdsource the Truth by going to crowdsourcethetruth.com. Check out the Counter Lawfare Fund. We'll see everybody soon. Have a great weekend.